Danilo, estás en micrófono.
Bienvenidos a todos.
Welcome, everyone. We are here in the third panel of ICIC Wednesday of the International Conference on Information Commissioners. It's last Wednesday. This year, we will have ICIC panels and other 5 panels up to December. Today, we'll have the honor to host the panelists, Maria Pacanales, Marcos Lindenberg, on privacy and transparency in health issues. The transparency and privacy issues in many instances, especially in healthcare, are usually seen as opposites. And we have to say that recently, with COVID-19, many themes that interest public interest, privacy in terms of health were broadly discussed in the public contact tracing programs, the publicizing of lists of people with vaccines or infected people using data for investigation, for epidemiological investigations and others. And many of the discussions highlighted a counter position between privacy and transparency, but we have to see that it's not about a simple opposition. There's a strong public interest to maintain the rights regarding transparency, access to information, usage of information for public interest, but also control over the data. We always have to remember that data protection and privacy is not exactly an instrument for secrecy or for restriction to data usage, but it's much more. It's a control instrument for people. And within the control, there's also a strong element for transparency and public interest. So there are many issues also where privacy, data protection and transparency gather and are not opposite. It's important to keep the content of the rights and the practical usage of personal data, always keeping control instrument for legitimacy, also considering public interest and in a time like this, but many other occasions when this data is necessary. And nowadays with the urgent needs, much is said about the usage of data when necessary for public interest can generate responsibility if the data are not used for public policies, mainly in terms of healthcare interest. And at the same time, there are many tools to protect data that are useful to reduce damage and the potential problems to individuals, since usage of the traceability tools, tools for safety, control, and so many others. That's why we now have a panel of high level in which these issues and others will be observed. We can have a general issue of what would be within this view, the instruments that should be more effective to assure the presence of the rights regarding transparency, usage of information, but also the control of the individual over his individual data and the usage of healthcare data. I have the honor to call the first panelist, Mrs. Vergara. Josefina Roman graduated from the University of Mexico, teacher of law by the University Anahuac, and has doctorate on the postgrad studies law. So it's commissioned by the Institute of Transparency and Data Protection from the state of Mexico. A year later, she is the president up to 2017. Now she's works at INAI for 2019 to 2026. She's been teaching law in many institutions, public and private, and now she's still a full teacher. Josefina Roman, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you very much, Danilo. Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be in this seminar on digital platforms. I greet especially the community of the International Conference of Commissioners for Information that with a great view has done this kind of forum. Of course, I'd like to also thank the General Controller in Brazil for the invitation to participate in this panel. And very especially, I want to greet Marcos Lindermeyer, Carnales, and Danilo again. Thank you for the presentation. Well, I'd like to begin saying that on behalf of the National Institute for Access to Information and Personal Data Protection in Mexico, INAI, it's an honor to be here at this forum. And it's called Transparency and Privacy in Issues of Health. Danilo, I like to do the introduction. Like we say in Mexico, it's an institutional, constitutional institution. And if transparency has a value for public service, but the human right to access for public information and the human right to protect acts, personal acts. It's not colliding rights. It's rights that we must say that complement each other. But in this sanitary emergency that we are going through, we say that these are fundamental rights that should privilege all government action because they convert into pillars for democratic governance, specifically in a transcendental theme as public health. The relevance converts in balance that should be kept in a way to protect privacy of a person, but at the same time to enhance the amount of rights to the community, as for instance, the right to access to information. In this context, in a first moment, we should understand that information on behalf of public institutions should allow us to understand governmental actions, and that based in those inputs as how all citizens can, first of all, assess government actions. We are all worried with the pandemic. We all want to know if we are going on the right path. Well, in terms of health, government action translates into protection of a public good that comprehends sanitary control, epidemiological surveillance, investigation, and social security measures. To know this information through the governmental institutions allows us to evaluate and also get to know about the situation, to have decisions that should maximize well-being and citizenship. This sanitary emergency and a way to bring assurance to citizenship for decision-making and also to evaluate governmental action. I want to share that since Mexico, INAI has concentrated efforts to adopt tools that somehow should make public information accessible as a relevant factor for citizenship. In a first measure, we had technical boards to constantly feed information between the healthcare system and INAI to provide accessible information to citizenship on the pandemic situation. So we could provide official data in open format that should be reviewed by all people, including civil society organization. And in the first phase, we, in terms of transparency and access to information rights, and later this board was amplified to take advantage of the right to privacy and personal data protection. In this sense, it seems very important to have a constant dialogue. That's a way we can follow up efforts for transparency. Another example is the diplomatic management platform for COVID-19. This platform has information on contracts between the government and the pharmaceutical companies. This effort was done by different institutions, Mexico government, and followed up by INAI. Another example is that in March this year, through a decision, a collective decision, we instructed this health secretariat to inform on the situation that they keep on the hospitals to tackle the pandemic, as all institutions assuring their human rights. We must solve the review resources where the answers from public institutions are not satisfying to people who require information. So from INAI, we instruct this kind of effort because we know the healthcare institutions are fighting the pandemic, but at the same time, we have to observe human rights. So in this same sense, we've been building different micro sites which are specialized, some based in information from the Mexican executive branch, where we seek to identify the information that should be relevant on medical attention issues, medical inputs, treatments against COVID-19, preventions for virus expansion, and also through another microsite, we can find all this in the INAI webpage. We execute works in another micro website to get closer to the population and provide timely information. And in these actions, INAI has sought to bring transparency to government actions and bring information to the population so they can find out about the emergency situation. And in this panorama, the enhancement of information quality and transparency in government in terms of public health have impacted the population well-being, and also through implemented policies in institutions management and providing clinical services. We should also mention the measures that the governments must implement to enhance the sanitary context brought by the international pandemic. In theory, privacy and the right to personal information protection is based in our legislation and cultural norms. Nevertheless, we are in a health crisis with the pandemic. So the authorities around the world have all been obliged to have actions to mitigate the expansion of the virus in their populations. And part of the measures implemented by the government implied the use of personal data, including the ones called sensible data. I'm almost finishing. The authorities who had to work hard together with private companies to develop technologies and have actions to control the pandemic through personal information usage without observing fundamental rights. Measures as geographic placement, contact tracing were established by governments in many countries, bringing worries in different sectors and alerting authorities about the risks of these measures or any other measure that could generate conflict with privacy. The usage of this kind of technology means potential risk for privacy, and different international forums in terms of personal data protection have worked the best they can to find a balance between the measures to assure public health, considering the emergency we go through, and right to privacy. I would finish saying that, of course, all authorities protecting personal data have been working specifically in some occasions with work groups regarding these actions towards COVID-19. The Global Privacy Assembly had a specific work group seeking to cooperate, recommend, exchange experiences, have best practices to find what Danilo was mentioning, this balance between the right to personal data protection, the right to privacy, but also the right to be informed on which are the decisions being made by the authorities in this matter. I'd also highlight that since the Ibero-American Protection Institution have seek transparency and protection of personal data and has the goal to broadcast information that should be relevant in this issue. Since APA, we've also been working in a coordinated way, in collaborating, and I believe this is the best moment to be creative and have solidarity and use the abilities from all authorities of the special institutions, organizations in terms of transparency, access to information, and protection of personal data. Thank you, Danilo. Thank you very much, Commissioner Josefina Roman. I think the exposition of actions from the data usage and also the tools to control the usage of data is meaningful, and the control from the individuals over the actions often because of their transparent and responsible usage. Thank you very much. Now I have the honor to pass the floor to Maria Pascales. Maria Paz was part of the team that instituted Digital Rights Organization in 2005, and 2016 integrated the directorate of the organization, and March 2017 took over the executive directorate. Maria Paz's work is related to the development and use of new technologies since free competition, privacy. Maria Paz is a lawyer from the University of Chile and a teacher at technology from Berkeley University. 2015, participated from Google Fellowship Program, the Center for Democracy and Technology, and worked at the University of Harvard. Maria Paz, please, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Danilo. Thank you for the invitation to the International Conference of Information Commissioner and the General Controller of Brazil. It's a pleasure to be able to share. I'm honored to be here in this seminar and to share perspectives since the work that civil society in Latin America has been organized around this attention that summons us to transparency and privacy in issues of healthcare and in the pandemic we are going through. So in this sense, the first I'd like to highlight, and also answering to some of the questions, it's the look to what kind of approach and implementation technologies, actions incorporated by the implementation of technology the governments adopted through this pandemic situation in the region to balance transparency and privacy, usage of data to be more effective and to be able to contain the pandemic. First, I'd like to say is that technology or access to information through implementation of different technologies had many goals. And so when we look at some of these risks to which we referred, transparency and privacy and different goals, there are some initiatives like the ones highlighted by the commissioner had to do with the delivery of information in terms of access to details of how we were tackling pandemic, where we could obtain best social healthcare information, how this was handed to the population. Others moved forward to have self-diagnosis and gathering personal data to generate recommendations that guided decision-making and how individually to manage their risks facing the pandemic. There was information raised because of enhancing the quality of decision-making, public decisions, and particularly to be able to use more efficiently the health capacities provided by the states, and others that also moved forward with solutions regarding contact traceability that from the technology point of view moved forward, but there was always traceability for contact, but it was done more through manual contact. And now in the pandemic, first time we also saw in our region some initiatives to at state level, federal levels, in countries which are federative, and some technologies to gather personal data to enhance traceability for contact. And lastly, we also still have some technologies regarding how to provide information over the inspection for quarantine, and also regarding the control of mobility to allow us to have better solutions on what kind of interactions population can have in regaining a given level of normality. So as I said, the issues of each of the technologies or data collection to provide transparency and enhance the available information for decision making, collective and individual, brings different problems or different ways to look at this balance between transparency and privacy. And this even more in the context of each of our countries in the region, where each of the solutions, technological solutions for transparency, have to be assessed in the technical infrastructure side, and on the other side, the legal infrastructure. So from technical infrastructure point of view, some relevant elements to assess have to do with how many of these technologies to collect data would insert in a society where there could be a diversity of penetration issues and the availability of technologies, internet connectivity, access to devices where the information was available. So all this effort resulted in internet technologies, and they made information available, and sometimes we had some gaps with connectivity in who in each country could access information. It also has to do of how the technologies should be useful regarding the level of digital access, different channels of information. And there's a last point in terms of the availability and usefulness of transparency measures used through technologies that would have a limitation because of specific ability. Once the information was delivered, the countries would be able to honor the commitments. So, for example, the speed by which they could deliver test abilities doing some kind of test or concur to healthcare issues and have some specific service, or in case of social benefits, which was the ability to quickly answers to the demands according to the information made available. And the last part has to do with the legal framework, specifically in Latin America, this pandemic and this intensive use of technology to gather data. So because of transparency, as an aid to the control for the pandemic, so we should have norms over regarding to the constitutional rights in each countries, for example, how this impacted access to information or privacy considerations. And in general, what we saw is that the plans didn't consider in the legal frameworks measures to solve this lack of general legal frameworks. So there were two cases I'd like to mention because we had interactions since the judiciary branch where the actions were inspected in Brazil, where it was the government tried to get access to personal data from the telecommunication operators to have some strategies against the pandemic, and there was a decision from the Supreme Court considering that the way this regulation was, this executive regulation didn't have the proportional to be compatible with the Constitution. Something similar in the case of Ecuador, where effectively it's one of the most emblematic in terms in the region, because in the decree where the state of emergency was declared, we had the possibility to access information, geolocation, to have the quarantine measures. And there was also a speech from the Constitutional Court in Ecuador, where the conditions by which this emergency state declaration should be interpreted, we had the need to effectively consider the protection of personal data. And so the measure was interpreted in a way as to provide proportionality, and there should be a commitment to safekeep the information. And from the perspective of information publicization, there was 120 resolution, the resolution of the human rights in Latin America, and the Constitutional Court of Ecuador referred to this norm to say that access to information needs to assure access to data, but the state must have measures to reduce digital access. So there was a call to measures to implement the safekeeping of personal information, and there are limitations to come from the perspective that affect rural populations, indigenous groups, and vulnerable. So I just wanted to highlight that from digital rights perspective and the Latin American organization, we work on initiatives for the pandemic, and in 2020, in 2021, all the information can be found in the website from Al-Sur. I will share the links in the YouTube connection so the audience can have this information. And we've been publishing many elements regarding the actions, the balance between access to information and privacy. We see there is a potential for development. Facilitation of technologies can have benefits and contribute to a more effective decision-making from the state. If we think about information that's added, but everything needs a legal framework with a worry about legality, proportionality of the measures to have an adequate balance between transparency and protection of private data. So we think this regards other human rights, and this balance should avoid that the information ends in a result of prejudice in exercising other rights. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's interesting how it's clear how technology can create new potentialities for use, but also risk, that meaning it's necessary to balance also power distribution and risk creation. So the balance is very important. It was mentioned in the Brazilian issue. I'd like to highlight access to information by the government in an executive decree, which was taken to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court recognized the figure of fundamental rights. In Brazil, it's the right to transparency is in the Constitution since 1988, and now we have both fundamental rights. I'd like to mention that the audience can ask questions in the YouTube channels, and we will consider them later in the debate. And now I have the pleasure to introduce Marcos Lindemeyer. Marcos is graduated in law by the University of Rio Grande do Sul. He's a federal inspector of the General Controller's Office, is chief of the cabinet of the Union Ombudsman and executive secretariat of the National Ombudsman, participated in the Amnesty Commission, and participated in the implementation of the law for information protection in Brazil. Marcos is also a member of the Commission to implement the personal data protection law in Brazil. Marcos, you have the floor.
Mucho gusto estar aquí con todos.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Maria Paz, Commissioner Josefina Roman, Danilo Doneda. Well, I will begin talking about something that should be obvious, but it's important to highlight. It's the present context where we have this debate. First moment, the first issue, we are in an exception scenario in the middle of a pandemic, something that didn't happen, didn't go through our minds before. So in this scenario, we had we have a situation that's different, a sanitary crisis, social crisis, economic crisis, budget restriction, flexibilization of many public procurement rules. And in this space that is extreme, we experience a behavior of some public contracts related to the health sector. We had situations in general issues about vaccines procurement, and also contracts where information is not so clear, contracts for acquisition and public entities to apply technological solutions, people movement, traceability, and public service digitalization that all countries have had to go through. So in a very short time, the states had to adopt many decisions with players in power situation that was different from normal situations. Many situations, for example, vaccines, government could have 4 or 5, 10, 100 companies that could supply the same product, but now we have like 1, 2, 3, or 4 companies. And the goal was to provide vaccines to the populations. And at the same time, we had digitalization of the public servants' relation to the states, because apart from citizenship, to interact with the state through apps and obtain public services is an important part of them through apps. In the virtual environment, the public workers began working from home in situations that are not the most adequate in terms of files management or information management or personal data management. And of course, an adequate culture to do this from home. In Brazil, we had a sensible context because we are in implementing the general data protection law. So in some countries, this is more mature, and here we are just beginning in what regards to the understanding on privacy of the public worker as someone who is exercising the power of the state. So these discussions on privacy had some results, but now are being discussed again because of the data protection law implementation, and the need from the population are here, and needs that are more and more critical. Here, there is a phenomenon that is relevant to keep in mind here in Brazil in what regards to the transparency policies, and more specifically, the mechanisms to access information. And what we see is a repositioning of the demanding parties. And what I mean by this is the vision of information access in many countries was related to social control, accountability, the political rights exercise, as I could say, the need to shed under light the data and decisions adopted by the government, because if we're not, they wouldn't be legitimate. But now we see a different phenomenon. People who need information to exercise their basic rights people which are in vulnerable situations or in urgent situations regarding the effects of the pandemic. So all this places us in some important spots. In Brazil, we had a growth in access to information over 20% since the beginning of the pandemic. A demand for more sensible platforms, easier platforms, and the users were not the standard users. The new users would need information to know when they would get their vaccines, if they would have any possibility of benefit for some income benefit situation, benefits for people who had their income compromised by the pandemic, and that's another scenario. And at the same time, when we more specifically regarding health under a look of the General Data Protection Law and the law of access to information regarding transparency, from one side, the General Data Protection Law as a right to know how this data is treated and who is the owner of the data, including in the public sectors. And transparency, when we talk about transparency policies, it's a bit broader. Obviously, there is the accountability dimension, the social control dimension, but also we mention a culture for transparency to exercise political rights. In both cases, transparency seeks to assure that the state actions can meet public interest. But once again, public interest, as mentioned by a Brazilian politician, it's like a cloud. Sometimes it has one shape, sometimes other times another. It's complex because it's an uncertain concept. It's difficult to understand the processes that involve understanding what public interest is in the concrete case. It would be public interest to follow the Constitution fully. Would it be public interest to assure fundamental rights? Would it be public interest to assure well-being of most of society? Probably yes. But to do that, it would be necessary. It's not necessary to place privacy or transparency in first place or contradict them. In Brazil, we had an interesting situation in which transparency became a means of protection for citizenship rights, as well as basic health rights, but also data protection. And at the same time, what we feel and we see is that we are not in the maturity degree, I don't know if because of the specific pandemic moment, in which we can say surely how the health policies have impacted the data protection and people's data protection. So there was a report called Viral Data in Brazil, and the paper dealt with contracts and data related to health policies mostly, and how the experts would declare information and access to information by municipalities, by the states. And what we saw was that information weren't 100% ready or available, and this was not mentioned by the states and municipalities. So individual rights, as well as, well, the individual rights of the data owners were vulnerable, but also the collective rights of how the public policies from the state should be managed and how the decisions were being made. So obviously there's no, in principle, when we began to discuss access to information and privacy in Brazil, always the discussion was access to information versus privacy, but it's becoming more and more clear that it won't be versus privacy when we talk about public power, but transparency is an important tool to privacy protection and privacy protection rights and citizenship rights. And I believe that we could close here, and I'm at your disposal for the questions. Thank you, Marcos, for your speech. Now we have some questions. I will mention a first one here for the three panelists, considering some themes that were mentioned, mainly regarding publicity of data and some issues specifically related to COVID-19, the pandemic. In this moment, there's a discussion in many countries, Brazil and others, about the publication of data of people who took the vaccine. There is a bill of law in Brazil to make this mandatory for the healthcare system. There are many municipalities that published states, and in the future, how this is as this is discussed in other countries, it's the sanitary and mobility issues are being discussed. And I'd like to propose initially a question on which would be the demands, specific demands for conciliation of rights to privacy and transparency using tools that, when are proposed, have a very strong component of transparency, but can present some reaction and even a social legitimacy process if people realize they can have problems with privacy and sometimes personal problems with the data publicization. So I ask if Commissioner Josefina would like to begin.
Gracias, Danilo.
Thank you, Danilo. Well, I can say that Mexico is a volunteer. There are some criteria established in IGNAI. We think that regarding vaccines applied to public workers in all levels of government, yes, it should be a public information. Not all people that should have taken the vaccine voluntarily, but are not public workers. So this is a first part in Mexico. I think that if we see this in a context, it's a global problem, not only regional, I dare to say, because like in America, now nothing happened, but we see this in Europe, They don't believe in COVID proof because they are establishing entry restrictions. So the countries in the EU will have to be in agreement, but Spain is doing it in a different way. Countries from Latin America, we haven't implemented any restrictions. So I think this kind of digital passport will have to be evaluated in international levels. Not only are these personal authority protection issues, each country is having their own decisions. In Mexico, we are treating public workers, so practically everything should be public in this issue. Thank you very much, Josefina Roman. Now, Maria Paz, would you like to answer? Yes. You will have to stop me because I can speak about this for hours. I will try to explain it briefly. First, why I'm passionate. Josefina mentioned I had the privilege to work in an expert group summoned by the WHO to assess this international standard creation, some instrument to support this certification of vaccine. The WHO seeks to certify the vaccine conditions and tries to separate the states where the vaccine certification for other effects, because the simultaneous exercise of many rights are at stake, transparency and privacy, but also these are two elements that allows us to exercise other rights, access to work, mobility, education, migration, and also at international level. So one of the things that we've been discussing more passionately in this expert group summoned by the WHO, which brought some difficulties to the work, are the different positions regarding the function of the certification and the information they deliver regarding the vaccines, because effectively we involve what I mentioned before on context. It's not the same to implement these transparency systems or these technological versions of healthcare passes or digital vaccine certificates in access to vaccine context and resources available, or the situation varies from country to country. And what we have to understand is that although a certification can be created to generate positive impact and to generate incentives so the population would take the vaccine voluntarily, what we generate is that the context doesn't follow the possibility that anyone can access vaccines easily, generating an exclusion of groups that are traditionally vulnerable. So what we also discuss in the WHO is the situation of the migrants, which are illegally in the countries, and that fear to access, if the vaccines are accessible to them, because access to vaccines is different. And even if the vaccines are accessible, how the data is used, these populations which are in vulnerable will be exposed to the usage of the data with a different goal. So what is the legal framework following the initiatives? Because if it's in a solid legal framework where information is assured to be used in a minimal way to assure immunity, but to certify vaccines, and there are strong mechanisms for different usage of information. So in most of our countries where this is not followed by a strong legal framework or controlled by independent institutions for data protection. So it's not the same situation. In Europe, you have the system being developed, and I also participated this IPV issue, how this is being developed, this issuing of mobility passes, but they have strong regulation and have control for misusage of information. So according to the legality principle, authorities have good resources to inspect the situation. This context is in other countries in Latin America today. With the effort the authorities have, well, we have restrictions in our region. So I could talk for 2 hours about this. Thank you very much. The experience is fascinating. Marcos Lindemeyer asks, because he knows the issues regarding the states in Brazil. Thank you very much, Danilo. I like to hear to the other panelists with such important perspective, but complementing what was said, first point, it's important to highlight that as an appeal, how the executive branch mentioned, there's a personal point of view. Well, considering this, it's important that we should consider that the personal data management by public power needs to be proportional and necessary to the goals. And what goals are we talking about? If we're talking about public policy, specifically on mobility data, so you can restrain somehow the virus transmission, it seems a usage of personal data to with public interest. If that is a personal data, if we talk about restriction for mobility because of vaccines, then we need to consider other issues, as for example, the inequality in access to vaccines and the risk we have to deepen other problems regarding social inequality and vulnerables, as mentioned by Maria Paz. When we see from another point of view, the state of vaccine, this is another treatment, how to have a passport on some kind of means to access information for public policy. But when we talk about publicizing the data of people who took the vaccines, first of all, there's a goal. We have general data protection law saying that health information is sensible, but at some time we can think that information on public health are sensible, but they can be made transparent to public interest. And public interest can be amplifying social control means over the development of the public policy. But look, the state might have means, and we hope they do, that to make control to assure that the people should have rights to access vaccines in a given moment of the vaccine plan, a national or regional plan. The state has the ability to know if the people could be taking the vaccines or not. In Brazil, we have the data. But obviously, there are behaviors that are divergent. But if there is sense in, because of some behaviors, to make health data transparent, like people who have health problems and situations of risk someone might have, risk to life regarding the vaccine. Is there a sense to make them transparent when the state has other means to control a policy? I don't know. This is related to the national context. It seems to me that in Brazil, we have the possibility that the state has control over this, and in a proportional way, you shouldn't make private information transparent because of social control. And in other cases, obviously, the cases of passports, controls, also in the context situation to evaluate public interest in concrete cases. That's it. Thank you very much, Marcos. I have some questions from the public. I will propose a last round of questions. Two questions. Are there risks regarding the surveillance, digital surveillance practices in promoting public health? Second question, which are the ethical implications of technologies based in data in the fight against COVID-19? I pass the floor to Commissioner Josefina Homa. Thank you, Danilo. Thank you. Well, regarding the first question, I'd like to say that digital surveillance shouldn't be under any legal framework. In these times, there are countries that did it with the best of intentions, specifying a means, but it still is. Geolocation is an issue that has been broadly discussed and analyzed by many experts in data protection. So this is the first point. So as digital surveillance shouldn't be subject to norms, there can be some risk even when the goal is to manage the pandemic. Of course, technology can bring much help and support in managing best results for the pandemic, but all companies, including the large companies that having massive management of personal data, must meet the legislation from each of the countries where they provide their services. So it's another issue. We know where these companies are and the ones that provide information safety, and it would bring risks and also goals for the personal data privacy authorities and goals for the local legislative branches as to updating or bringing new legislation regarding this. And I think it also implies the goal to know how to cooperate and coordinate, innovate, and explore new options. But I believe in a coordinate way, maybe beginning at the regional level and then bringing it to the intercontinental level. I think it would be one of the large goals we have. Thank you, Danilo. Thank you, Commissioner Roman. Now I pass the floor to Maria Paz, if you want to answer. Yes, keeping on with what I said before, there are many risks of legal frameworks, because in the pandemic context where data are considered an essential element in an effective response, there's an additional sensibilization regarding citizenship, because their collaboration is essential to have a more effective control of the pandemic, and that is certain. But there is a two-way vision that the information should be delivered without question and more attention by the rules of how this information is going to be dealt with. And what we have the risk to generate is a logic of all or nothing. If you want to control the pandemic and you want to protect public health, deliver your data, ask nothing. And that shouldn't be the narrative. The narrative should be, we all want to collaborate with the delivery of our information to the extent there are parameters where we can be at ease and sure as to what information is used, that there should be control of who can access them and such, and the sanctions in kind on deviation of use. If we meet all the elements, and the elements are in the narrative, it would be more regarding human rights. So this logic of all or nothing, if you question the state when they ask for your data, this is a mistake to place citizenship in a false dilemma, where you say, if you want to assure a right, you must sacrifice all others. And you see, it's necessary, as we mentioned, there are ways where we can compatibilize the rights, and also in things that have not to do with technology, and often transparency measures, as mentioned by Marcos, might have to do with the implementation with other measures, and not only technological measures that can be more adherence to the proportionality right. So what we have to have is a narrative saying that the norms produced and the data collection because of public interest situations as the pandemic should be not a open card, a white card, but a commitment with citizenship, and the commitment from the state that should be clear rules in terms of how this data is going to be used. What was mentioned about the goals for the authorities to control and the legislative branch. And so, as I mentioned, what we see is that the data collection with the only goal to tackle the biological situation is, well, it's also used for the social aid, also used for the people to come back to their employment situation. In the case of Chile, there's a mobility pass, although the passes goal, there are many employers who are offering jobs conditioned to the possession of a mobility pass, and that generates brings ability to the companies to hire new employees. So these instruments shouldn't be turned into population surveillance instruments, and that's where we must be critic, and this initiative shouldn't go over this. Thank you. Thank you, Maria Paz. Now, Marcos Lindamaya. Thank you very much, Danilo. There's a question we always have to ask when the state needs to know the population to assure a good, because sometimes the state goes over the necessary limits to assure this goal, obviously. And it's important to consider that to protect privacy and the image rights, it's essential to protect us as a society in time, that this shouldn't end when you provide the data to the state or to a private agent. This information follows us through our whole lives. It's part of our biography. In the story of a society, a history of a society is made by many biographies. So we also need to think which is the true urgency, the sense of urgency that makes us hand so much data to the state, and if that's proportional to the urgency that we are going through right now. Every time we see an urgent situation like the pandemic, we all are involved somehow, and sometimes this is over our understanding or beyond our governance. But this urgency doesn't justify the creation of an legal uncertainty environment in the relations amongst the citizens and the state. And in these moments, it becomes more dangerous to have monitoring policies and personal data collection, because we know the discussion regarding privacy and the privacy laws are a result of the fear we had in the population of creation of large databases which are produced by the states and what people could do with this data. Just like we have our lives, the state has a life and goes through many circumstances. What they are going to do with the data, well, we can know if we have transparent institutions with responsibility, if we have a national privacy policy well implemented. But if we don't, or we don't have it at a given time, the risk remains. The data will remain there. So these would be the main issues when we give up our privacy, when we accept a legal uncertainty situation. We contribute to the fragilization of the democracy concept itself. Thank you. Well, Marcos, thank you. We are closing the panel. It was a rich panel. And I could open the floor to the panelists for any final observation, any message, beginning by Mrs. Josefina Roman. Please, you have the floor. Thank you, Danilo. I'd like to close with the idea in the sense that we're talking about two human rights, access to information and protection of personal data. And most of specialists have the idea that they collide, but I like to talk about balance, or that's what we have to find, this balance, because right to personal data protection seems to me that can't be over the right of access to information and any other. Some rights open doors for other rights, human rights, and we also should begin talking about document management and document storage in Mexico and all over the world. And sensible personal data is relevant because it's important for the pandemic control, but there should be clear rules where the archive authorities and the legislations and the principles can show us how this data should, when the data should be disappear, what is used for prevention and statistics, and know how to manage and store this data. But the sensible personal data that are not necessary for the pandemic management should have clear rules of how would be responsible, how they should be destroyed, and the consequences for any authority in government not following this aspect. Inclusively, all hospitals, there are workers of healthcare sector that should be also monitored. Thank you, Mrs. Holman, and if you allow me, the issue of data protection application to public archives interests me, because in Brazil, the law didn't mention this. This is a relevant issue that has to be interpreted with the files law, and it's a work that we will have to face at some time, and I think soon. And thank you for your collaboration. And now I pass the floor to Maria Paz for final words. Thank you, Danilo. As Commissioner Roman mentioned, the need to see how we can liberate the data potential. I don't want to leave you with a view as if my intervention would be negative regarding data action. But I think to make this balance mentioned, we have to seek which would be the ways to regulate how to anonymize or add data to have statistic usage, because unfortunately, the experts say that in the pandemic, we need more data, and this will be useful to take decisions in public policies. But as mentioned, not all sensible information is going to be needed to do this work. So we need clear conditions for the use of this information, and the state has responsibility, just like in the technologies for data collections and implementing them during the pandemic, and service conditions for the applications. We need to also control the action of the private parties. We had to have a regional disabilitation of the data, but it doesn't regard most of the applications. So all data collected would be in a vacuum. Who is going to inspect the actions taken with the data? So all these are questions that are still open. And the last I'd like to say is that I'd like to be clear in terms of transparency and privacy, because when there are transparency gaps, information gaps on part of the state, that generates other privacy problems. And in Chile, we had a problem where the authority feared how to deliver information to the public about the disease transmission. The maps were publicized where they showed the geolocation of the COVID patients, and that generated tremendous risk that these people would suffer prejudice. But exactly this kind of thing happens when there's a transparency gaps, when the press recurs to the mechanism because there was no good way of delivering the data. So when you deliver precise information with privacy protection criteria, there will be better balance instead of bringing risks. So I think this should be taken in consideration for a next pandemic, and also the transparency goals for the state. Thank you, Maria Paz. The idea of transparency can influence the transparency issues since the conception of the transparency program as factors for consideration. Thank you for your contribution, which was very detailed, very precise. And now I pass the floor to the third panelist, Marcos Lindemeyer, for the final words. Thank you. There is no way I cannot concur with the other two panelists. We mentioned the need for a mature governance of data in public sector, and data government goes through transparency, open data, privacy, and files, of course. Files also. In Brazil, we had, as Danilo said, an important goal of how to interpret the files and data protection at the same time. In the 1991 law, if I'm not mistaken, with the law from almost 30 years later, which is the data protection law in one case, and at the same time to understand that, for example, the secondary value of the files comes from the historic relevance and the proving aspect of the data, which is beyond the data collection. How to make these two dialogues talk to each other, and assuring the right as a nation to find out about the history that makes us as we are. Well, also, I'd like to close making an invitation, because this issue is related to another issue, which is transparency by design, which is the issue from ICIC workshop on the 30th, and we'll have many experts talking about this fundamental issue to understand how to change the way our institutions and the public sector deals and creates the information to assure privacy and transparency. of our data. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marcos. And now we will close the panel. It was a rich panel, very interesting. Thank you all three panelists, SEC, for the invitation to moderate. I'd like to say that we will have another 5 sessions of ICIC Wednesdays up to December. And also thank the translations, Soledad and Thomas, that translated to Spanish and English, because Marcos and I speak Portuguese. Thank you, Soledad Tomás. Thank you to the panelists, to the audience, and see you later. Bye-bye.
Un abrazo desde México. Gracias.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.